Hey Dev Team, welcome back to Flutter with Drag. In the last episode we managed to get some form of layout done and our app is looking a little bit better than it was. In this episode I want to start putting in some security, a little bit of authentication. It's going to be the basics, but it's going to be a start. Okay, so at the moment I have the app running and I also have the server running. I'm going to leave the server running, but I'm going to stop the app because we need to install some of the Firebase dependencies. So coming over to our terminal, I'm going to create a second terminal and work from in here. And the first thing I want to do is add Firebase Core to our app. That's needed really. If you're using anything within Firebase, we need to install Firebase Core. So we can do Flutter pub add Firebase Core, and that should set everything up for us. Perfect. We're also going to be using Firebase Auth, so I'm going to also add Firebase Auth. And now that's done, I'm going to try and set up the automatic configuration for it. This is hit and miss sometimes, and sometimes you can't do this because some of the features within Firebase require you to do a different type of install, but for now I think this will work. And we're going to use a command line tool called Flutter Fire. Now, if you haven't got Flutter Fire, you'll first need to activate it, and you can do that with dart pub global activate flutterfire _CLI. Now this isn't a per project thing, you need to do that once for your computer and that will activate Flutterfire. I've already done that and so I can now use the Flutterfire config. And doing that, it should configure the projects for us. So it's going to my Firebase account and it's now asking, it's found 3 projects in there and it's selected the global conference one. If it doesn't select it automatically, it will ask you which one you want. Now we need to select which platforms we're going for. So we're going for Android and iOS. I'm going to deselect web and hit enter. It'll do a bit more, it will register some of the apps on Firebase for us. Once that is done, it'll ask us for a name, so for iOS. So I'm just going to put example conference, global conf. That'll do. When it's done, we'll get some app IDs coming back like that. They're not important, we're good to carry on. Okay, next I'm going to come over to our Firebase and go to our authentication tab, and I'm going to set up sign-in methods, and for now I'm just going to use email and password, and we're going to enable that and save. Great. And now I'm going to add a user. The user is going to be myself, drag@test.com, and password, it's going to be password 123. Okay, let's add that user, and we've now got a user ID starting with YDD. Okay, that's all we need to do there. Now I'm going to come back to our app and run it, and it will take a few seconds because we've installed a load of extra packages and it will need to compile everything up. Okay, that took a little while, but it's up and running and we're ready to continue. So what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? Well, we have a server which we're calling our API requests from, and we want to know on that server if the user is a valid user of our app, and we want to stop them being able to or we want to stop other people being able to access the app. So if we come over to our web browser and go to localhost 3000, we have hello from Express. And if we type in events after it into the URL, we get a list of all our events back. And this is publicly accessible. And if we changed our code in our server so that we could write events to the database, such as we will be doing for the users, for example, for changing their profile information, then that's going to be accessible to the world, and we don't want that. If I come to this page and I'm not logged in, I want an unauthorized message. So that's what we need to do. Somehow we need our server to know whether we are a user of an app. However, users log into the app, not the server. So we need a way of passing from the app to the server details about the user. And it might be more than just their user name. It might be information such as, have they got permissions to do a certain task, things like that. Okay, let's start at the bottom. Let's get logging in to our app working first. And initially I'm going to do that without a login screen. I'm just going to log into the app directly. So I'm going to come to our screens, home.dart, and under our scaffold I'm going to create a floating action button, which is going to be a floating action button widget. That takes an onPressed, and it's there that we want to do something. It also takes a child, and the child is just going to be text or login. Okay, make that a constant. So if we look at our app, we now have this login button at the bottom that doesn't do anything, but could. Okay, so what are we going to do when we press it? Well, logging in is an asynchronous task. We have to wait for it to happen. And so we're going to await Firebase Auth instance, sign in with email and password, and format that. We need to put in the email and password. So it's drag@test.com, and the password was password123. We'll save that. That will log us in, except it won't immediately. What it will do immediately is complain that we haven't set up Firebase. So let's come back to our main.dart, and in our void main we need to ensure that Firebase is set up, initialized with the automatically generated configuration that happened when we ran the Flutter fire. So here we're going to say widgets Flutter binding ensure initialized, and then we're going to await Firebase and it's not importing that. Let's fix this. It's going to be an asynchronous function. There we are. Import it. Firebase Initialize App. When we initialize app, we need to do it with some options, and the options are going to be the default Firebase options for the current platform. And that has been generated for us in this Firebase options.dart, and that has a load of security information and various other stuff, and that initializes it all for us. Once that's initialized, then we can run our app. Okay, let's do a hot restart for that to take effect. In fact, not a hot restart, it needs to be a full restart. And now, if we click login, it should log us in. Now looking at our debug console, we can see that we've got the debug message saying that it's notifying token listeners about, and you can see our user ID there. So now we know we've been logged in. Okay, so that's great. We're now logged into this app. Later on, of course, we'll do it with a login screen with asking people for their username and password. But for now, I'm going to comment that out. So now what? What do? We need to pass something now from from Flutter to our server. And what we can pass to our server is something called a web token, a JWT, a JavaScript web token. And we can get that from Firebase. So again, just as a test in our floating action button, I'm going to do a final token equals await Firebase Auth instance current user, and that may be null, so I'm just going to put I'm going to put an exclamation mark because we know we're logged in and this is only for testing. Get ID token. And then I'm going to just print that token to our console so we can see what it looks like. So now if I click the login button, I've commented out the actual logging in because we'll remain logged in until we log out or the cache is cleared. But if I click login now, you see we get this token. So I'm going to copy that and come to this web page, which is jwt.io, and this has a debugger for JavaScript web tokens, and we can paste that string that I've just copied in, and we can see the decoded version of it. So we can see it's a secure token that's been created by our app. We can see what time this user was authed. We can see the user ID and the sub ID, and when it comes to Firebase, it's the same thing. We can see what time it was issued, and we can see what time it expires. We can see the email address of the token. We can see whether the email has been verified, and we can see that it's been, we've used the sign-in provider password. Now the thing about this token is it's split into three parts, which you can see here, separated by these period signs. The first part is the header, which just explains the algorithm and the type of token it is. The second is our data, and the third part is the signature. Now what this means is if we change anything in here, if we user intercept that, so let's take this q at the end of our data and change it to a lowercase q, all of a sudden this token is not valid. The payload data doesn't decrypt properly, and we know that it's not a valid token. If we had the signature, we could also paste the signature string in there and it would confirm whether things were valid or not. So now we can take this token and we can pass it to our server. So let's do that. So coming back to our code, I'm going to comment out our whole floating action button. We don't need that anymore. And I'm going to come to our repositories conference.dart. Within this, we have the ability to get things. And what we want to do is when we call HTTP GET, we also want to send this token along with it. So let's first of all get the token. So we can put here, exactly as we did a minute ago, token equals await Firebase Auth instance current user and I'm going to put a question mark there. Get ID token. Okay, so and I'll spell await right as well. So as long as we have a current user, we'll get a token. And you can see from the description here that it will automatically check whether the token is valid or has expired, and will get a new one for us. Now, if it can't get a token, then our user's logged out, and we'll be dealing with that another way later, so we don't need to worry about that here. And then we need to pass this token to our server. And so we get from this path, but we can also include here some headers. And we're going to include the authorization header. And the authorization header is going to be token and then our token. And we can save that. So that token is being passed to our server. So now let's close down Flutter and come to our server and to our index, because now we need to do some coding. Now we need to do some coding here. And the first thing we need to do is create some middleware that helps us deal with our authentication. And we're going to do that by creating a new file, and I'm going to call it auth.ts. And we're going to create a function called auth middleware, which is going to take in, it's going to be an asynchronous function. It's going to have a request and a response, much like the pages we've got so far, or the API calls, and also a next function. And this is very important for middleware because we have to make sure that it moves on. Once it's done ours, processed this, we want it to call the next bit of middleware, so on until it goes through. So we've got some squiggly lines, that's because we've not typed it. So we're going to, this is going to be a type of request. We need to make sure it's from express. This is going to be a response. And again, we need to make sure it's from express. And this is going to be a next function, also from express. Okay. So in here, first of all, we're going to say const token equals from the request headers, if there are any headers, the authorization header, or a blank string. So token is going to equal the authorization header we've passed in, or if there isn't one, it's going to be a blank string. And let's just for now console log that token. Once we've done anything, as I've just said, we need to call next. And I keep putting semicolons at the end of this, it's not needed. Okay. We then need to export that function. So we're going to export auth middleware, and that will make it available as a module for us here. So back onto index, and after app, we can say app use auth middleware and save that. Now, if we come to our terminal rather than our debug console and to our server and watch the output here when I refresh the app. So when I refresh our app, we know that there's going to be a call to get a list of events. So we should now hopefully see our token here. Bingo. So now our token is being passed from Flutter to our server. Okay, but how do we know if this token is valid or not? Well, again, Firebase has our back there. So we can say, after we've got our token, we can decode that token So I'm going to create a constant decoded token, and that is going to await our Firestore or Firebase admin auth verify ID token and pass in the token. Now that's not going to work because we just need the token by itself, not this string at the front. So at the moment that will fail because token exists. So what we're going to say here is replace the word token space with an empty string, and that will get rid of the token. Now you might ask, why have we put token there at all? Why don't we just pass that? And you could. You could also, the word bearer is often used here. It's up to you. But I think this helps us see what's going on, and when we look at headers, if we're trying to debug something later on, you know, we can see that this is a token. Imagine something had gone wrong and this is just an empty string. We would have no idea what was happening. Okay, so now we've got this decoded token. So this time, let's console log the decoded token. So refresh our app. Give it a second to reload. And there is our decoded token. Now, if the token wasn't valid, it would fail. So let's not replace the word token. Let's take out the T from there. Okay, so the T is going to remain, and that will make our whole thing invalid. If we refresh now, what will happen is we get an unhandled rejection saying the decoding the Firebase ID token failed. Okay, so we need to be able to handle that. And the way we're going to do that is put it within a try catch. So we're going to try to decode the token, and if that fails, if there's any errors thrown, we will catch it. Okay. Now, if we catch the token, then what we want to do is say, no, you can't access this. If we get to this point and the verification has failed, we're going to return a result status 401 send, and we're just going to send back the message unauthorized, like that. So again, if we now refresh, we should see an unauthorized happen. Now, if we come to our app, you can see that that's not loading. And if we look at the debug console for our app, spelt unauthorized wrong, but that doesn't matter. You can see that that's what we're getting back. So we're going to have to change our app as well to be able to handle that. It shouldn't ever happen because the user shouldn't be on that page if they're not already authorized. So let's put the T back so it works and refresh again. And we should see our events come back. Okay. Now we might want to do something a little bit further. We might want to check and have access to the user's user ID elsewhere within our API. So what we can do is we can add that to our request header. So we can take the request and we can make the UID equals the decoded token UID. However, we can, down here, we can also make sure that the UID equals null if there's been an error, because we might not stop people at this point. We might let it go on a bit further and allow unauthorized people to access some of it. but for now we'll stop it. Now we're getting these errors here, and that's because a response doesn't have a UID. It will actually work, but our TypeScript is saying there's something not right here. So just for neatness, I'm going to set this up so it will work. And the way we do that is in the server directory, I'm going to create a new folder called types. And in that, I'm going to create a file called index.d.ts. D basically means a definition or a description file. Now this needs to be a module, and we can turn it into a module just by putting an export there. And we're going to declare in the global, in the namespace of express, we're going to take the interface, which is the request interface, and we're going to add on to that a UID, which can either be a string or a null, and save that. And you can see now that UID taken over, it now understands that that is valid. Okay, that is essentially all we need to do at the moment to make it run. What we can do, just one further test, is coming to our controllers and our events controller. When we get our events, just as a test, I'm going to console.log here our request UID. So again, I'm going to also take out this console log from our auth.ts. Let's hit refresh, come to our terminal, and there we go. We can see now that within our controllers we have access to the user ID and more data should we want it, but we'll deal with that as we come around to it. Now, do we want to deal with this unauthorized? Do we want to deal with something if it all goes wrong? I think the answer is probably yes. So I'm going to close down all the TypeScript stuff because that's done for now. And I'm going to come back to our conference repository, which is in our lib repositories conference.dart. So we've got this get event happening here, and we're getting a status code coming back if it's failed of 401. And if that happens, we want to throw another error with a message. So I'm going to, just outside of our conference repository, I'm going to create a class called repo failure, and that is going to implement exception. And in here, I'm going to have a message, which is going to be blank by default, but we need to have a constructor for that. So repo failure, this message. Okay, you'll see how we use that in a second. So coming down to this result where we get our result, before we decode it, we can say switch the result status code. And here, if we have a status code of 401, we are going to throw, we're going to throw a repo failure, and we're going to say auth failed. That is our message. And for now, we're going to have a default for everything else, which is going to just return our JSON decoded body. Okay, so if the result comes back as a 401, we're going to get that. I need to come back to our auth in the server. Oh, I'll tell you how we can do it. It's going to say we need to fake it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add an X before the token. But when we do the call, that will break it. Okay, so let's come to our debug console and refresh. And there we go, unhandled exception, instance of repo failure. That's coming from our homepage qubit. So it's trying to get a list of events and failing. So let's handle that. In our homepage state, we have a homepage initial and a homepage loaded. I'm going to also copy that and have a homepage failed. We might rename some of that later. And that's going to also have a message, which we can then print to the string, print to the screen. If we have a message, we need a constructor, and it needs to be a const constructor. And because it's a state, we need to put our props in and say that that is an equatable thing. We need to compare it when the state changes. Save that. Okay, coming to our homepage qubit then, under load events, we can try to do what we're doing. However, if it fails with a repo failure, let's catch that error. And instead of emitting homepage loaded events, we're going to omit the homepage failed, and the message is going to be the message that is part of the repo failure. Okay, so that message, eMessage, is going to be the one that we set up in our conference here, which is auth failed. So now we're handling that state, but we're not displaying anything. So let's come back to our home page and then to our agenda, because this is where it's all happening. So if the home page is initial, return circular progress indicator. Else, if home page is loaded, return our list. Well, what we want to do there is copy that and say else if home page failed, and then we're just going to return now text state message. And if we now refresh our app again, we get the message auth failed. We might do something neater with that later on, but at least it's taken through. So to come back to our conference repository, let's take that X out so it's no longer broken and refresh. And now our app works. Finally, if we come back to our localhost events and refresh on a web page, we now get unauthorized. And if we come back to nothing, to the root, we also get unauthorized. And maybe that's not what we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our middleware and I'm going to move it down to after the get. So the middleware won't apply to that. It only applies to anything after. So if I save that and now refresh our page, I get hello from the Express web server. And if I go to events, I get unauthorized. Folks, we're going to leave it there for today. If you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It does help me out. And we'll see you next time. For now, take care, and we'll see you then. Bye now.